thanks so much the presence of Professor Antony Duff and Sandra Marshall also. Thanks so much for being here. I think it's a great opportunity for us, and it's great to have you here and get the opportunity to discuss with you. I think that your ideas are being more and more influential in the region, and they are enormously attractive and timely. So it's really a great honor for us to have you here. Brevemente en español, simplemente decir, el profesor Antony Duff enseña en la Universidad de Minnesota, enseñó durante muchos años en Stirling, en Escocia, dirige la excelente revista Filosofía and Criminal Law, y ha dirigido también una serie de colecciones de libros en el área de Criminal Law, y ha hecho aportes, yo creo que extraordinarios, mostrando una apertura, yo diría, muy inusual en la doctrina penal para buscar, pensar intersecciones entre el derecho penal y la filosofía política, por un lado, como pocos, y hoy creo que vamos a tener una oportunidad también de escuchar algo al respecto. Duff ha sabido conectar las reflexiones de derecho penal con cuestiones básicas de filosofía política, en particular con teorías marcadas por el republicanismo o el comunitarismo. Yo creo que esa sola conexión ha sido enormemente importante. Del mismo modo, como pocas personas, ha sabido conectar estas reflexiones en materia de derecho penal y de castigo con preocupaciones de teoría democrática y de teoría de justicia, pero en particular en teoría democrática él ha desarrollado un enfoque que entiendo muy novedoso, que lo presenta como un enfoque comunicativo, un acercamiento comunicativo al derecho penal. Y creo que también hoy vamos a tener indicios al respecto. Y al mismo tiempo, o sea, al mismo tiempo que he tenido esta apertura a vincular al derecho penal con disciplinas respecto de las cuales el derecho penal normalmente se siente y quiere estar aislado, o sea que eso yo creo que ya es un extraordinario mérito. Creo que ha hecho preguntas de trascendente importancia y reflexiones de enorme importancia, como las relacionadas a las precondiciones de la responsabilidad penal, cuestiones sobre cómo pensar el castigo. Él tiene una mirada que es muy crítica sobre el castigo, al mismo tiempo que entiende que en el centro de la reflexión penal tiene que estar este llamado digamos, frente a la comunidad, a que el que ha cometido una falta de cuenta ante todos, digamos, de lo que ha hecho. Pero eso es independiente de la discusión sobre el castigo y no necesita ir de la mano del castigo. Por eso creo que tanto en el enfoque que ha mostrado Antony Duff en la materia, en la apertura que ha tenido, en el modo que ha sabido vincular al derecho penal con disciplinas respecto de las cuales el derecho penal normalmente se aísla, y por la sustancia de sus reflexiones, por el atreverse a hacer preguntas que el derecho penal normalmente no se hace, ¿no? Y por la calidad de esas preguntas, yo creo que bueno, es un gran privilegio que tenemos de tener la oportunidad de discutir hoy con él aquí, y de algún modo la presentación de él va a ser una excusa para abrir a la reflexión y a la discusión de todos, así que lo vamos a escuchar ahora y vamos a tener la oportunidad de debatir con él, o sea que bueno, también gracias especiales a ustedes por estar acá en época mundialista, y bueno, entonces, Anthony, so I leave you, we open the floor for you, and we are so pleased that you are here. And so after your introduction, we will be having a discussion with you. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for inviting us here. It's our first time in Latin America. We're having an interesting and enjoyable time. It's great to be here. I should begin with two apologies. One, I can't speak Spanish, so I must speak in English, which is embarrassing for me and bad luck for you. The other is, as you can hear, I speak quite fast, and as time goes on, I speak faster and faster, and that makes life hard for translators, so I apologize for that in advance. I will try and slow down. If I can slow down, I will. If I don't slow down, just directly, I will slow down. But also, I have PowerPoint, which should help you see what's going on. If you can't hear, you can at least see. So, to work. Here's my question. Must criminal law be exclusionary? Our criminal law, in fact, very often serves to exclude those against whom it's used, to exclude them from the rights, the benefits of citizenship. Here are 3 ways it does this. Think first of imprisonment, which is the most dramatic kind of punishment, and that excludes both materially, you're locked away from society, and symbolically, you're outcast. Think of this dramatized by the Californian law, 3 strikes and you're out. You have 3 felonies and you're out, which means you're imprisoned for life. That's a dramatic kind of exclusion of those who offend. But think too of the further effects of it, the further consequences of imprisonment. Again, I speak mainly of America and Britain. If you are imprisoned, you lose the right to vote. You lose the right to education, you lose the right to welfare, and so on. You suffer, in some places, so-called civil death. Even after you've served your time, you're still excluded from the benefits of membership. Think too of the rhetoric of crime and punishment in many countries. It's portrayed as something that we, the safe, law-abiding, do to them, the criminals, the enemy, the outsiders. We protect ourselves against them by locking them up and so on. Or, from the other side, if you are one of the people being punished, it's something which they do to us, the disadvantaged. So always there is the language of exclusion, the we who punish, the they who are punished. The language of the war on crime, the war on drugs, the war on terror. Again, war implies an enemy, an outsider against whom you fight. So the rhetoric of crime and punishment is often, again, exclusionary. There's the we who punish and the they who are punished. The question is, must that be the case? Must criminal law be in that way exclusionary? Must it always serve to exclude those against whom it's used? And some would say it must be like that. That's how things have to be. Here's one argument. Some will say, look, if you're realistic, criminal law is always a matter of power. There are the rulers who impose law on those who are ruled, and criminal law is in the end, behind all the window dressing, criminal law is a matter of the exercise of coercive power, and that always serves to exclude. There are those with the power who punish those without the power. That's one saying that criminal law must be exclusionary and can't but be. A different argument is normative. Some say that criminal law is justifiably exclusionary, because they say if you break the law, if you commit a crime, or you commit certain kinds of crime, you thereby forfeit your standing as a citizen. You forfeit your civic status. You are justly excluded then from the realm of the civic law-abiding polity. So they too say criminal law ought to be exclusionary. It excludes those who forfeit their membership by breaking the law. So many would think that criminal law is and must be or has to be exclusionary. My aim, well, one word of caution. It's always very easy in doing criminal law theory to be parochial. I know quite a lot about English and Scottish criminal law and about American criminal law, and I know how things work there. And there, this is the pattern of exclusion. Maybe that's just a feature of the particular pathology of these two countries, that we are unusually oppressive in our criminal law. So I'd like to know how far this is a more general issue about criminal law in other places, like Argentina, or how far this is a problem peculiar to England and America. But from where I stand, in those systems, this is a problem. And it's tempting to think from those perspectives that criminal law is, in essence, exclusionary. But my hope, my aim, is to resist those views and to say that criminal law can be and should be inclusionary. I want to try and work towards, I'll do this in part today, to work towards an inclusionary account of criminal law as a democratic institution, a law fit for citizens, fit for the citizens of a republican polity. Law is something which we can recognize as our own criminal law, which doesn't serve to exclude those against whom it's used. So the aim is to work out a conception of inclusionary, not exclusionary criminal law as an ideal towards which we can aspire. And part of the argument will be, and I'll come back to this shortly, to attend more carefully to the particular roles that we play in relation to criminal law. What roles citizens can play as citizens in relation to their own system of criminal law. And I'll say more about roles later on. So, I've emphasized citizens and talked about the criminal law which is fit for citizens to impose on themselves. It's true, of course, that many of those who are subject to criminal law, many of those who appear in court as defendants or victims, are not formally speaking citizens. They're here, they're immigrants, without citizenship, they're temporary visitors, temporary workers, refugees. Many people who are not citizens are nonetheless bound by criminal law. So why should I focus on citizens being the key category? One answer, which I'll come back to shortly, is that citizens are still the law's primary addressees. We must begin with citizens as thinking about law, and then move beyond that to other kinds of people who also fall under the law. I'll come back to that very, very shortly. Also bear in mind, what matters here, I think, is not so much formal or legal citizenship, whether you're defined in law as citizen, but a more substantive notion of what it is to belong in a certain place. What is it for that place to be your home? And that's a much broader notion of citizenship. Many of those who are not formally citizens, nonetheless, are members of the polity and should be seen and treated as citizens. And then those who are not citizens should be seen as in the distinct category of guest, where to be a guest is itself to have a particular kind of political and normative standing. As a person who is here, whether welcome or unwelcome, who has many of the rights of citizenship in virtue of being a guest. Well, I was then struck when we came into the law school for the first time on Monday, and there in the hallway you've got the preamble to the Constitution on one of the pillars. And there, part of the preamble, which I won't even try to read in Spanish, it would be embarrassing, but in English, as I read it, it's the aspiration to assure the benefits of freedom for ourselves, for our descendants, and for anyone in the entire world who wants to live on Argentinian soil. To anyone at all who wants to be here is then a member of the polity. That would be a noble aspiration which avoids the worry about being a formal citizen. You want to be here, and so you're welcome. So the issues there about the conditions of membership, how far we can have a genuinely open door policy and embrace anyone, or how far we need to distinguish between citizens and guests. And I can't discuss that further here. But we must, I think, begin with citizens. We'll start by asking, here is the criminal law. We have to ask first, well, whose law is it? Or whose law should it be? Because the criminal law is a part of the political structure of a particular polity. It's criminal law of Argentina, or England, or Minnesota, or Scotland. It's always the law of a particular polity as part of that polity's political structure. So we ask, well, whose law is it? And the first answer must be, in a democracy, it's the law of the members of that polity. It's the law of the citizens who make up the polity. It is our common law, our shared law. So if we ask whose law is it, it's our law because we are members of the polity. And that's why the law itself should, in aspiration at least, not be what they impose on us or we on them, or the sovereign imposes on the subjects. It's a law we impose on ourselves. That's the aspiration of democracy. We govern ourselves, we make our own law, and subject ourselves and each other to it. So the first answer to whose law it is, it's the law of the citizens, who are members of the polity. It's the law they make and accept for themselves, the law by which they bind themselves and each other. That has to be the first answer to whose law is it. The question then is this: if we see law in those terms, as a law we impose on ourselves and each other, a law which is our law, not a law imposed on us, what kind of criminal law can we impose on ourselves? What kind of criminal law can respect us as citizens? What kind of law is apt or fit for citizens to subject themselves to and to impose on each other? That's our question. And that's a version of the question of what makes criminal law inclusionary. It's a law which includes, a law which treats us as members of the polity. In that sense, a law which is our law. Now, of course, if I'm to emphasize citizenship as being crucial to law, we need to know what is citizenship, what are the key features of citizenship. And here, one would need a whole book about citizenship and a whole political theory to go with it. But here are what seem to be the salient features of citizenship in a democratic republic. We can start with Dworkin's slogan, that citizens owe each other equal respect and concern. We recognize each other as fellow members of the polity who are owed an equal respect and concern. That's one kind of slogan which is important. It will need unpacking in many ways, but we'll start with that thought. Add to that the notion of civic trust. To recognize another as a fellow member, is to see them as engaged in the same enterprise of living together as a polity, and to begin by assuming not the worst of them, but the best of them. Assume that they will respect you, they will respect the law. Don't assume in advance they'll be hostile. So some notion of civic trust, not a starry-eyed civic trust, which is unrealistic, but a civic trust that we see each other as citizens is important. And that's reflected in the idea that we're presumed innocent until proven guilty. Citizenship is also essentially an inclusion notion. If you're a citizen, you are part of the polity, you have access to the benefits, the rights, and also duties and opportunities of our civic life. So citizenship is essentially an inclusion notion. You are included as a member with access to all the benefits and burdens of membership. It's also important to see citizenship in active terms. Citizens are agents who have to play their part in the life of the polity. But your role as a citizen is structured not just by rights, but by duties, responsibilities which you have as citizens. And I'll come back to the importance of agency later on when we look at particular roles. But bear in mind, citizenship is not just a passive role of being due certain benefits or rights. It's an active role of having certain duties to undertake. It's also, and this is also important in a liberal polity, it's also a limited role. We play many roles in our lives. We're citizens, we're students or teachers, we're parents or children, we're friends, all these different roles we fill. So citizenship is one among other roles we play. The polity is one community we belong to among others. It's limited, it's part of our life, but not all of our life. And the polity makes a limited claim on our attention and our concern. So citizenship has these dimensions: equal concern, respect, civic trust, and so on. Then the criminal law, if it is to be apt for citizens, must itself reflect these dimensions of citizenship. It must be a law which does treat us with equal concern and respect, a law which does take seriously civic trust, and so on. So we ask, what kind of criminal law could reflect citizenship in these ways, could be apt for citizens? It's worth thinking, in general, to understand criminal law not as an abstract structure of principles, but as an institution which plays a role in our political life. It's worth thinking about the particular roles we play in relation to criminal law, and asking what those roles involve. Because we play many roles in relation to criminal law, each of which brings with it a distinctive set of rights and duties. So I want to look at some roles we play and ask what they show us about criminal law and what it could be. One caution. I'm asking first about what kinds of roles are properly played in a just system of law. If we're dealing with unjust systems, there are further questions about roles and what we can do with them. We start off with a notion of criminal law in a just society and what that could involve. So think about just systems of law to start with. First of all, there are certain professional roles which people play. There are judges, there are police officers, prosecutors, defenders, prison officers, and the like. They all play professional roles in making and administering criminal law. There are also, in many jurisdictions, formal roles played by lay people. You might serve as a juror, or a lay judge, or lay magistrate. There you are not there as a professional, but you're there playing a formal role in helping to administer the law. But then there are also more individual roles. You find yourself playing, often without choosing to, in relation to criminal law. You might become a victim, or a witness, or an offender. You might become a suspect in a police investigation. You might become an accused or defendant at a criminal trial, a witness summoned to give evidence, or a convicted defender, or this odd notion, which I'll talk about later, of being an ex-offender after you served your sentence. All these roles individuals might find themselves playing in relation to criminal law. And my claim is to be that all these roles are normative roles. They're roles which are defined by structures of rights and duties. Civic rights and duties we take on as citizens playing these particular roles. And in each case, this will be important later on, we must attend to both the active and the passive aspect of the role. The role as bringing with it certain burdens. But also the role is bringing with it certain active duties. There are things you ought to do as bearing that role. So with every role we ask not just what may we do to that person in virtue of their role, but also what can we ask them to do as that role bearer. This will be important when we think about offenders. So think about roles and ask in each case what kind of rights and duties define that role as a role played by a citizen within a polity. I won't say much about the formal professional roles. It's clear there are civic roles, by which I mean they're roles which are defined in terms of certain civic rights and duties as part of the polity's governance. You know, if you ask what it is to be a judge, a lawyer, a police officer, a prison officer, that brings with it an account of the duties and the rights that you have as bearing that role, the part you play within the structure of the law as an active institution. And some individual roles are also, I think, defined as civic roles. If you ask what it is to be a victim, you're a victim of the crime, what kinds of rights and also what duties do you thus acquire in virtue of being a victim? If you witness a crime, again, what rights and duties do you have as a witness to a crime? What is your role as a citizen who's witnessed a crime? What can be demanded of you? So if you're summoned as a witness at a trial, in each case, you must ask precisely what rights and duties go with that role. If you're a victim, we talk often about victims' rights, what rights they have, rights to assistance, rights to support, rights to have their crime investigated. We also need to ask what duties they might have, a duty to report the crime, a duty to give evidence against the person who attacked them, for instance. So again, the role of victim as a normative role brings with it and counts to certain rights and certain duties. We have to ask what those rights and duties might be. We start off with civic duties, meaning by that what you should do as a good citizen. If you become a victim or a witness, what ought you to do? What's your civic duty? There's a further separate question, how far those civic duties should be made legal duties, which might be enforced by law. And that's a further issue to be addressed. So civic duties are not always legal duties. The duties of citizenship go beyond what the law requires of you. It's what's required of you, like, socially rather than legally. And when we think of victims or witnesses having duties, a duty to report the crime, a duty to give evidence, a duty to come forward, we've seen them now as, if you like, partners in the enterprise of law. The law aims to, the criminal law aims in part to identify wrongs as crimes and to call to account those who commit those wrongs, to bring them to trial and to punishment. If we say that victims and witnesses have duties to report the crime, to assist in the prosecution, we're saying they too are partners in the enterprise of law, because the law is, again, their law as citizens, and they too are then part of the law's enterprise. So to talk of the duties of victims or witnesses, is talk of their duties precisely as partners in the law of enterprise, or we might say collaborators, but that brings with it certain disturbing connotations of collaboration. I think it's important, though, that if the law is indeed, as it aspires to be, this our law, as citizens, then we ourselves must see ourselves as part of the law's enterprise in a just system of law. So we have our role to play in helping to make the law effective and helping to administer the law. I've talked so far of roles which do seem to belong with citizenship. As a citizen, you might become a victim or a witness. And that doesn't in any way threaten your status as citizens. It brings with it new duties, perhaps, which are burdensome. But duties you acquire as a citizen who's become a victim or a witness. But other roles might seem more difficult. Other roles might seem in tension with the idea of being a citizen. In particular, the roles of offender, or offender who's being convicted, or ex-offender. And it's interesting that when you read studying criminal law theory, and also political rhetoric, these roles are often described in essentially passive terms. What we can do to offenders once they've been convicted. And here's one thought, which again I mentioned earlier. Many would say that offender is not itself a civic role. If you're an offender, you've thereby forfeited your civic standing by breaking the law, by committing the crime. You are no longer fully a citizen. And that means we can then treat you, we, the law-abiding, we, the courts, can now treat you in ways which would normally be wrong as a breach of your civic standing. Because you exclude yourself, the story goes, from citizenship, and therefore we can treat you now as someone who is excluded from the rights, benefits, and status of citizen. So from this point of view, offending, treating the crime, forfeits your standing, you are then out of the civic role. And we can do things to you. You now have a passive role as a recipient of the burdens of punishment and so on. But the role is seen essentially in passive terms, and offender, on this view, is not itself a civic role. Offender is a denial of your civic role, if you like. It's a forfeiture of your civic role. And that's how offenders are often seen. They are excluded, they exclude themselves. The question now is, can we avoid that implication? Can we see being an offender, or being a convicted offender, as itself an active and civic role, as a way of being a citizen which brings with it both rights and also duties? If we say offenders still, as offenders, are still to be understood as citizens, they still have certain civic rights and civic duties as offenders, that would then be a genuinely inclusive criminal law, a law which includes all those who are bound by it, including those who break it. Some would say, why bother? Why try to show that being an offender could be a civic role? Because, look, they will say again, to offend is to forfeit your civic standing. And I thought, again, this might be parochial, it might be what happens in Britain and America, for instance. The idea that offenders forfeit their standing is a very powerful one. And people resist the thought that they are still full citizens. So why should we resist that powerful thought? Well, one reason is it shouldn't be that easy to lose your civic standing. Being a citizen, being a member of the polity, is an important dimension of a person's life. Maybe you can in the end lose it, but you shouldn't lose it just by committing even a serious crime. It shouldn't be that fragile. So being expelled shouldn't be that easy. It also goes with a recognition of each other as fallible, imperfect human beings. We see in the offender not some bizarre alien, but someone like us who has committed a serious wrong, very wrong of the kind which human beings do commit. So, and a recognition of our fallibility, our fellowship in being fallible and human, goes with the being very slow to say a person has forfeited their standing. Citizens can go badly wrong without thereby ceasing to be citizens. Our fellows can go badly wrong without ceasing to be our fellows. So to say you forfeit your standing by committing a crime is to be too quick to dismiss the person who goes wrong from fellowship. More pragmatically, if we're serious about rehabilitation, if we think our aim should be to rehabilitate offenders, to restore them to what they have lost, then we don't achieve that by measures which exclude them. That just makes it harder to gain rehabilitation. So even in pragmatic terms, if we think about regaining standing, then we can't simply have them forfeit their standing from the start. So at least we should be very slow to think that anyone forfeits their standing by committing a crime. There is a real question, I think, whether there are some kinds of crime, especially if repeated, which are so terrible that they make continued membership impossible. Because if you've done that, whether that might be some, you think it's the worst kind of murder or a series of terrible crimes, and can we still see that person as a fellow citizen? Or should we even try to? Maybe in the end the answer is no. I'm not sure about this. But at most that would apply to very rare, most terrible, serious kinds of repeated crime. The general run of offences, we shouldn't say, well, you've done that, so you forfeit your standing. We shouldn't be so quick to exclude. So then, so far my claim is we should, if we can, try to see being an offender and being a convicted offender as itself a civic role, a role played by someone who is still a citizen, a role which brings with it, as all civic roles do, a distinctive set of rights and also of duties. The question is how to do that. Let me start on that task, not with offenders, but with those who are accused of crime, to illustrate the kind of argument we've been engaging here. There you are accused of a crime and you appear at trial, you appear in court. That's a distinctive role you have now. Your role is now the accused. That role brings with it a range of familiar rights, right captured by a sort of due process or a fair trial. You have a right to a fair trial, a right to be proved innocent, and so on. That's all familiar. But as to what duties you have as an accused person, what are your particular civic duties now you've acquired this role? Again, a role you might have acquired through no fault of your own. You might be innocent, but accused. And you find yourself stuck with this role, but still that brings with it certain new burdens. What duties might you have? So again, I think we should not, on one picture, the accused person's role is passive. He is there as the object of an inquiry. We ask of this person, is he guilty or innocent? And that portrays the accused as a purely passive purely passive figure in the trial. The person about whom the court will judge, but who has no active part to play. That seems to me, I think, a mistake. We should, with this role as others, see the role as an active role which brings with it distinctive duties. What are these duties? Well, if you see the trial, as I would portray it, as a process according to account, then when you're accused, you are charged with committing a wrong, a public wrong, and you're called to answer for that in the court to your fellow citizens. The trial is a process according to account. We call the accused person to answer to the charge, to answer for their conduct if they've committed the offence. And that process, according to account, is the way in which we take wrongdoing, take criminal wrongdoing seriously. We show we address the wrong, and also address the wrongdoer as a fellow, by calling him to answer. He answers to us, collectively, to what he has done as a breach of our shared criminal law. So the criminal trial, as according to account, is a way of both taking wrongdoing seriously, we address the wrong as a wrong, but also treating the offender, or the alleged offender, as a citizen who can and should answer for his conduct to his fellows. So now this is now a distinctive role. The defendant, the accused person, isn't just now a citizen who is presumed innocent. It's someone against whom there is a well-supported charge of wrongdoing. His innocence is now in question for good reason. So that is a new role he acquires once he faces this kind of supported charge, once he's on trial. So we ask now, what civic duties might go with that new role? If you are accused, what duties should you esteem as acquiring? Well, there are some familiar legal duties. The duty to appear for trial. If you don't appear, then you can be arrested and brought to trial. A duty to respect the proceedings of the court. A duty, if you give evidence, to tell the truth, not to commit perjury. A duty to accept the court's verdict. Beyond that, we might ask, again, about civic duties. If I know I'm guilty, how should I behave? Should I then confess my guilt? Or can I properly sit back and say, well, prove my guilt if you can, but I'm not going to say anything? Again, if I'm a good citizen in a just polity, is it my civic duty to confess if I am guilty? And there's a room for controversy there about how we should understand the role of the accused person. Do I have a duty, again, a civic duty, to take part in the trial? To answer the charge, to give evidence, to answer for my conduct? Should I play an active role in the trial and assist the court in judging my conduct? I'm inclined to say that in a just system of law, we do have those kinds of civic duties, because, again, the law is our law. And if we violated that law, if we violated that law, then we should be prepared to answer for it in the court. That's not to say that these civic duties should be legal duties. That's not to say we should, by law, require defendants to give evidence or to speak. Because if you have a just system of law, if you have a just criminal process which calls to account those who commit genuine wrongs, if you are justly accused, maybe wrongly, but justly accused, if there is evidence of your guilt, then you should, as a citizen, be willing to play your part in the process of judging your conduct. That's your civic duty, to take part in the just criminal process. But if we ask then, well, should that civic duty be a legal duty? Should it be a new offence to refuse to take part? Then there are obvious reasons not to make the civic duty a legal duty. For a start, if you have that legal duty, then there is obvious dangers of oppression. The person being coerced into giving evidence, the person being coerced to incriminate themselves. We all know that he might think, as a matter of political morality, that the court has no authority over him. There are all kinds of political rebellion, political dissent, which have that implication. And the only way to express that dissent is to refuse to take part in the trial, to remain silent, to refuse to be guilty or not guilty, to refuse to have anything to do with it. It's important to leave the accused that kind of freedom to... They can't avoid the trial, but they can at least make clear they want no part of it. So we might say they have the civic duty to take part, but that civic duty should not become a legal duty. That's the important contrast between civic and legal duty. And that's why the right to silence is important. As a matter of civic duty, you should speak, but you have in law a right to remain silent, and that right protects the defendant against the accused, against various possible kinds of oppression. There are further questions I can't pursue here about the accused who is awaiting trial, what kinds of rights and duties they have in that role. In particular, how far it's appropriate to detain them pending their trial if they're not yet being proved guilty. But again, there's a further issue about what it is to be an accused person, what rights, what duties that brings with it. But that's meant to be just an illustration of how thinking about roles, the roles we can play in relation to criminal law, the rights, the duties those roles bring with them, can help us to understand criminal law as a particular kind of institution, a particular kind of practice. If we see the trial as a process according to account, we then see how the accused has a distinctive kind of normative role to play in that process, as too do the judge, the jurors, and witnesses, and so on. So roles are a good way of understanding an institution and how it operates, by seeing what roles it defines and what those roles involve. I want to move on, though, to talk about offenders and their civic role. Again, one question, which I won't try to answer here, is if you have committed a crime, and if you are in a just system of law and you would, if convicted, face a just, appropriate punishment, do you then have a duty, a civic duty, to confess your crime, to turn yourself into the police, and accept your punishment. Again, I'm trying to say that as a matter of civic duty, if you are a citizen in a just system of law, you have that kind of duty. It's your law and you violated it, you should then, as a matter of civic duty, be prepared to confess your own guilt and accept your punishment. I want to focus, though, on those who have been convicted, not those who are in fact guilty, those who have been convicted by a fair trial, and what their rights and duties might now be. And to ask in particular whether a convicted offender can also be an active civic role we play. Again, it's often portrayed in passive terms. We ask, what can we do to the offender? Punishment is imposed on them, inflicted on them by the court. And their role in the way it's described is purely passive. They are the ones on whom punishment is imposed. My question is, can we see a convicted offender as itself a civic role a person can play, which brings with it distinctive rights and also distinctive duties, active duties? I think we can. One point is this: punishment is typically portrayed as simply imposed on the offender, who's its passive recipient. But in fact, punishment isn't typically like that. Punishment is not just imposed on you. Punishment is a requirement. You're required to do certain things. You are required to pay a fine. You are required to undertake community service, unpaid service of various kinds. You are required to meet your probation officer. In some countries, you're required to turn up on a given day to serve your prison term. You're told your sentence is 6 months, and you will turn up on this date in the future and serve your term. So punishment is typically, in the first instance, not really imposed. It's something you are required to do for yourself. You're required to undertake it. So punishment gives the offender an active role in undertaking punishment. And that's an important point, I think. Punishment is often said to be a debt we owe. And debts are things that I pay, ideally. Again, paying a debt is an active role I undertake. So we shouldn't assume at once that punishment is simply done to the person. We can see punishment as a duty they undertake as the offender. Your duty is to undertake your punishment as an active role, not just suffer it as something passive. If we think about along these lines, if we think of punishment as something not merely undergone but undertaken, punishment is something you do as the offender, you do to and for yourself. What kind of punishment could we then imagine? What kind of punishment would fit with this conception of being an offender as an active role? In particular, we should look more seriously at the different modes of punishment. Again, people doing penal theory, at least those who do it as a matter of normative theory, often talk about how severe punishment must be. They try to measure its severity. They don't talk enough about what punishment means, what different modes of punishment mean. But that's worth thinking about. What does it mean to imprison a person, to fine them, and so on? And what kinds of punishment and what kinds of meaning are appropriate for citizens to impose on themselves and each other? For instance, think about fines. You're required to pay a fine. Now that doesn't by itself undermine or negate your citizenship. It's simply you're told to pay this money. Nor do fines reaffirm citizenship. They're simply neutral. You pay the money and that's there you go. By contrast, think about, I'm not sure what you have in Argentina, but certainly in Britain we have community service. You're required to undertake so many hours of unpaid work on some useful project, painting houses or clearing litter or doing something useful to the community. And that's one kind of punishment. You're told to do 100 or 200 hours of community service. That's a kind of punishment which seems to me to reaffirm citizenship. Here you are, you're doing something for your fellow citizens as a recognition of the wrong you committed as a criminal. So community service is active. It's something you undertake. You go out there yourself and you do the work. You turn up and undertake the work. You do it, and if you do it, it's done as itself a manifestation of citizenship, as a civic role. Here's what you're doing to show your recognition or to make reparation for your crime. So community service seems an ideal punishment if we take punishment seriously as itself something undertaken by an offender as part of their civic role. The same is true of probation. If you're on probation, you are then told you are still one of us, but you must undertake this kind of monitoring, this kind of mentoring, to, again, deal with the crime you committed. Again, probation, too, treats the person still as a citizen who has taken on these extra duties because of what they've done. Again, the duties are still civic duties which they're required to undertake. And probation, like community service, is still an active, not a passive punishment. It's something you undertake as the offender, not something simply done to you. So you can see these kinds of punishment as fitting the model of punishment itself as an active undertaking, and the offenders having a civic duty to undertake their punishment as part of their recognition of what they have done. So far, so good. But, it will be said, quite rightly, punishment doesn't end with fines, probation, community service. In the end, even if punishment is initially required of you, in the end it will be imposed. If I don't pay my fine, then the money is taken from my bank account or from my wages, like my activity at all. If I don't undertake the community service or probation, in the end I will appear in court again, and in the end, in many systems, I will end up being imprisoned. So even if punishment initially takes the guise of a requirement, something I must do as the offender, in the end, it will be so punishment is in the end going to be simply imposed. I become purely passive. So in the end, punishment can't be seen, this is the objection, as a matter of active civic duty. Because in the end, always at the end of the line, is imprisonment. If I don't pay the fine, I don't do the service, then I end up in prison, and imprisonment is exclusionary, something simply imposed on me. Therefore, says the objector, punishment in the end has to be seen as exclusionary and imposed rather than required as an active duty. One question is whether we must have imprisonment as always the final sanction against those who don't undertake other kind of punishment. I'm not sure we need to. But I think about imprisonment itself. It's true that imprisonment is, of its essence, exclusionary. You're locked away behind the fence, behind the wall, or behind the barrier which tells you not to move. So in its impact and also its meaning, it excludes you from ordinary life. That's certainly true. On the other hand, imprisonment can be undertaken. You can be required to report to yourself to serve your sentence. You'll be in an open prison where you're told you may not leave, but there's no physical barrier to leaving. So imprisonment can be undertaken rather than merely imposed. And even when imposed, there are still ways of making imprisonment other than a mere denial of citizenship. Go on and look at many English or American jails, see what goes on in there. What goes on there is not a way of treating people as citizens. But still there are ways of modes of imprisonment which at least preserve some notion of citizenship. Well, how is a person treated? How are they addressed? Are they addressed by a number, or they are addressed as Mr. or Ms. So-and-so? Are they treated still with respect? How far is it possible to maintain any kinds of social, familial ties? How far do we try to maintain rather than sever the links of community? I think, too, an important symbol here is to do with the right to vote. Certainly in Britain, controversially, if you're serving a prison term, you lose the right to vote. In America, if you serve a prison term, you lose the right to vote, sometimes for life. In many parts of Western Europe, if you're in prison, you still get to vote. Now, doing the right to vote is a way of symbolically reaffirming citizenship. You're in prison serving your term, but still you vote because you're still in prison, a citizen. So there are ways of making imprisonment something other than a straight denial of citizenship and fellowship. There are ways of treating prisoners, okay, they're imprisoned, they are for time being, their participation is suspended for a time. But the suspension can be less than complete. We can maintain ties and maintain connections. And it's a suspension which aims at its own ending. We aim always towards the end of prison and towards a welcoming back into community. So imprisonment is still there as exclusionary. And for that reason, imprisonment must be reserved. They're just not in Britain for only the most serious kinds of crime which deny fellowship. But even imprisonment can be, to some degree, consistent with a recognition of citizenship. We can still treat prisoners as fellow citizens and not really as outsiders. Or so we can hope.
Take a few more minutes.
I'll mention one further question. I won't pursue it in detail here. Again, I don't know how far this is a problem in Argentina or how far it's a problem peculiar to America and Britain. The liberal rhetoric is that punishment is finite. You serve your time, you pay your fine, you serve your 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 years, and then punishment ends. Your debt is paid, the state is clean, you are now once again a citizen in good standing. That's the rhetoric of liberal punishment. But of course, that's not in fact what often happens. You leave prison. You're now this odd figure, an ex-offender. Which is what you were called, again, certainly in Britain and the States, you're a kind of ex-offender. It's strange because ex-offender implies that you were an offender, now you aren't an offender. But yet, somehow the taint remains, you're now labelled as an ex-offender, so the taint of offending still remains with you. And that taint has substantial consequences. You can face a range of so-called collateral sanctions, collateral consequences, which reinforce exclusion. You're excluded from a whole range of normal rights and benefits. You may find that you can't vote, or you can't get certain kinds of employment, or you can't get access to welfare or education. Quite apart from the informal effects of punishment. If you're known to be an offender, then you might find it hard to get employment anyway. So the question is this, which I will leave you with rather than trying to answer. I can talk about it more later on. If we're serious about punishment as a civic enterprise, about seeing those who commit offences still as our fellows, one question is how, by what modes can we punish people? What can we demand of them as by way of punishment? Another challenge is how we then treat them once they finish their punishment. How far do we, how far can we treat them then, once again, as citizens in good standing? How far can we avoid that continuing taint of being an ex-offender? So, can punishment come to an end, or is punishment always going to be continuing taint on a person's life? I think I'll leave you with that question rather than trying to answer it.
Thanks so much. Entonces tenemos un micrófono atrás y tenemos tiempo para discutir un poco, para hacer algunas preguntas y ver si estar. No sé, entonces si abrimos para la discusión, si alguno quiere hacer alguna pregunta. Let me start with a question while we wait. Well, first about you didn't say much about the Republican theory which was behind this approach, but I think that yes. So maybe I would like to hear a little bit more about the contour, the shape of the Republican view. But I think the Republican view would be very insisting in the importance of integration, and so how to deal with the offenders, given the importance we give to integration. And in particular, I was thinking that it's not only that we have to, treat offenders as common fellows and treat them properly, but perhaps, given this political theory, we have very special duty concerning them in terms of, what to do to reintegrate them to the community. And there is one dramatic example that we have here in Argentina, also related to those who committed massive crime, because there was a very serious debate, very dramatic debate, about whether they could attend classes actually from the UBA in prison, as other prisons were able to attend. And so there was a discussion. Actually, there was a commission, and the university wrote a report saying that given the crime, the kind of crimes that they had committed, and so that they had renounced to everything, and so that they had no right to attend to those classes, which were, and I would say that, I mean, from different reasons, I mean, there are different reasons and different perspectives, but particularly for those, I mean, who come from a Republican view, I mean, the answer should have been just absolutely the opposite, that there is so tremendously important to those who committed those terrible crimes to engage with them, I mean, to open the possibility for them to study, say, human rights or civic duties, etc. So I wanted to emphasize, I mean, the importance that for republicanism has this thing of reintegration. So in the light of cases like the one we have in Argentina in these dramatic circumstances, and the particular response that they actually, even from, I mean, that they received. So they were denied the possibility to study in prison. No? So I don't know if you want to say something about republicanism on this kind of case.
A bit, yes, perhaps not too much. Perhaps 2 points about republicanism. One is that often in certainly legal theory, you get a picture of political structure as being essentially hierarchical. There's the sovereign or the state who makes law, and there's us who obey law. And the classical legal theories often take that forward. They think that the sovereign makes the law, and we ask, do we have a duty to obey the law made for us by the sovereign? I think one feature of a Republican theory is to deny that kind of structure. For a Republican, then, it is we who make the law. We might create institutions to give it formal effect. The state is then part of the mechanism which we ourselves create to administer our law, but the sovereign is truly us, we collectively. That's one point. So republicanism involves that notion of equality. A second point, which bears especially on offenders, I think, is this, that many kinds of political theory, those influenced by contract heron ideas, take the link between citizens to be one of reciprocity. I owe you respect and concern so long as you reciprocate. If you don't reciprocate, then maybe all bets are off. If you break the contract, then perhaps you're out. So if you think of reciprocity as being the key to what binds us as citizens, then it's easy to think that offenders forfeit their standing because they failed to play their part in the bargain. We think of a social contract, and they've broken the contract, and so, well, then they cease to be part of it. So I think if you take notions of contract or reciprocity as being the key, it's easy to see offenders as losing their standing. If instead you think of some notion of solidarity, a fellowship, which is not chosen, not created by contract, but simply a given, we find ourselves as fellows, then that seems to me a more plausible account of community. And then that makes it harder to see offenders as losing their standing just by offending. They're still fellows, but fellows who have done wrong. So I think it's important, this is very crude, but I think it's a useful slogan to think not of reciprocity, but of solidarity as being the key to membership. But then there is the further question, which I mentioned in passing there, and which you've brought up now. It's easy to say, but even often quite hard to live, the thought that for the vast range of crimes, even serious crimes, committing the crime doesn't make you an outcast. You committed even the murder or the rape, you're still one of us, you're still a fellow. We can say that and we can mean it, even though even that is quite demanding. Then you think of the most serious kinds of atrocity, whether you think of individual cases of repeated horrible kinds of mass murder, or think of political cases of atrocity. And so if we say, well, even then, we would recognize the perpetrator still as your fellow, still with all the rights and status of citizens. Okay, they must address their wrong, they're still members. That gets certainly much more demanding. And that's actually brought out quite nicely by your example. So if we ask, well, let me go back one stage. one step is this, that to put such people on trial at all is still to treat them as fellows. We don't say, look, you're simply out. You're called to account still what you have done to us. So the very process of trial is itself an inclusionary process. You treat the defendant still as a fellow who must answer for their conduct. But then what happens next? So we say that prisoners have the right to attend classes in general, so shouldn't they too have that? And then you think, what does that demand of those in the classes with them? Those who might themselves have suffered, have had relatives who were victimized. So to say, yes, they too must have all the rights to go with ordinary prisonership is certainly a very demanding doctrine to take, very demanding on other citizens. And I'm quite happy to say that this kind of conception of criminal law is rightly demanding not just on offenders who are required to undergo punishment, but on all of us who are required to behave towards them still as fellows. And that is demanding, and rightly so. The question is, how demanding can we properly be? If you deal with the worst kinds of crime, it's now a very demanding claim to make on what citizens should do. And I guess if you ask me this, could I say to the person who lost a parent or a child in the atrocity, I said to that person, you must sit next to the person who killed your son in class and recognize him as a fellow. Can I say that? I don't know. But that seems to be the issue, the problem here. I'd like to say, yes, even they, our still citizens, even they must be recognized as such. I'd like to be able to say that. I'd like to be able to believe that I could myself act accordingly. But I'm not sure if I can.
Yeah, but in prison, I think that they were attending classes, or other prisoners were attending classes in prison, within the prison. And so I think the answer depends on many things, but also particularly on your normative theory. And I don't think that it's easy for republicanism to deny this, given the stress they put in the importance of integration and reintegration. I don't know what is the argument from the Republican side to say no, even if it's demanding. It's something that I would say we need to do and we need to pursue because we need a community which is integrated by all the members, and even those who committed the worst crimes, or particularly those. We need to make a special effort for reintegration. And in what consists this particular effort? It's not that we're going to give a prize to them, but it's that we are going to allow them or help them to think about the wrong they committed, etc., etc.
I thought you were talking of attending classes.
No, in prison. No.
But there is still, I think, a genuine question here. We can talk about an aspiration towards treating as fellows even those who have committed the worst kinds of crime. And that's one thing. We ask, what should we demand of each other? That's another thing. How far can we demand that we achieve our aspirations? And maybe, again, one question is what we do in the way of providing education and other services within the context of the prison. But think of the case where, think of various kinds of restorative justice, where there is a meeting between victim and offender to discuss the crime. Now, on the one hand, that kind of enterprise could be an important part of treating the offender as a fellow. We try and get them to recognize what they've done by talking to the victim and so on. So that could be an important way of recognizing fellowship. And we might well say that if a victim was willing to do that, even to the person who had done them a terrible wrong, that would be impressive, admirable, worthy of respect. So that's how I talk about aspirations. If we now say, well, should victims have a civic duty to willing to face the offender and talk to them? I'm not so sure about that. Again, it's a matter of how demanding we can be of ourselves and of others in this kind of context. So I think there are problems here about how far we can turn aspirations into civic duties.
Roberto? Por supuesto, el que quiera hacer la pregunta en castellano lo puede hacer, él tiene traducción. Pero sí,
Okay, thank you. You explained how is it possible to treat offenders or criminals in a non-exclusionary way, including prison. But before that, you offered 3 reasons why we should do that. Because the fact that it is possible to treat them in that way is not a reason in itself to treat them in that way. But you offer three reasons. I didn't hear a Republican argument, but other kinds of reasons. One is that exclusion makes rehabilitation more difficult. The other one is that it shouldn't be that easy to lose civic standing. And the third one is the one I want to focus on, is that we are also fallible, you said. And then we should be more careful with offenders in excluding them from civic standing, because we are also imperfect, or we could also be in the same situation or something like that. But I want to hear more about that, because I don't know whether there is a kind of situation in which we, as citizens, lost our moral authority to blame them for what they did, or what is the idea behind this argument that we are fallible and then we can't exclude them from society?
I didn't mean that we lose our authority to blame them if we ourselves commit wrongs. I think that just isn't true. And I don't think I meant that we should see ourselves as potential murderers or rapists either. It goes back, I think, to what it is to the notion of solidarity. To recognize someone as a fellow. And to recognize that fellowship isn't contingent on being virtuous, on being properly behaved. We're fellows, like it or not, even with those who are, in virtue of being human, in all kinds of ways, fallible and often unpleasant. So again, it's partly that as I see it, fellowship of this kind is something which is not chosen or selected. It's something which we find ourselves living with these people. And we've recognized that our fellowship can't be that contingent on good behavior. Does that make any sense at all? So it's a notion of solidarity with others simply as human beings. And thus recognizing that as human beings they're going to go badly wrong. Does this help at all?
Yes, I'm not sure.
Again, I think it's the contrast here between solidarity and reciprocity. Reciprocity involves the notion of defining quite precisely what we expect from each other. That's the notion of the contract. I agree that I will behave this and this way towards you. I won't do this, so long as in return you behave thus and thus towards me. So reciprocity involves the notion of being able to define what we demand, and also then, if we don't get what we demand, then all bets might be off. Solidarity is, in a way, a more ambitious notion. I recognize you as a fellow, even though, and of course, as a fellow, I expect in the sense that I would demand of you certain things, but I don't expect that you will always perform those. And my recognition of you as a fellow is not contingent on your performing what you ought to do. In that way, solidarity is more inclusive than reciprocity, because it goes along with recognizing others will go wrong and do wrong, but still remain our fellows. That's a thought I was trying to get. So, to say at once, if you commit the crime, you forfeit your standing, seems to me to be a very shallow kind of solidarity. I'm friends with you so long as you're good. I think something deeper than that is needed.
Yes, I don't see exactly the relationship between solidarity towards them as human beings and our own fallibility as moral agents. So we can also make wrong things. And that's the reason why we should be solidaric with them. Or I don't see the connection between solidarity and our own fallibility as moral agents.
I think because that's part of what makes us fellows, if you like. Yeah. That's part of what makes us fellows. Part of what we have in common is fallibility. It takes different forms, it's more or less serious in different cases, but to recognize, so we don't look down on them as being pitiable wretches when we are perfect and fully formed. So I think there's a notion of what we, solidarity implies something in virtue of which something we share with them. Humanity. And humanity brings with it notions of aspiration and also notions of imperfection of various kinds.
Okay, thank you.
Let me say one more thing, though, which might or might not help. I do think notions of solidarity and community are, in a way, fragile. In other words, I don't have a knockdown argument to prove that we must recognize the offender as our fellow, even though they're offended. Communities can be exclusionary. They can say, no, you don't belong to us, because, and I can't say a priori, that must be wrong. All I can do is appeal to a certain kind of moral imagination. Can't you recognize that as your fellow? So argument gets difficult in this kind of context, I think. In the end, community is a matter of who you can be brought to recognize as your fellow.
Mari. Después tenemos ahí y después tenemos ahí, atrás.
Hi. I would like to know your opinion regarding this issue, which is nowadays is under a lot of discussion in Argentina regarding gender-based violence and the prosecution of those cases. Because usually in Argentina, or at least in Buenos Aires, you can pinpoint some arguments regarding moderation in criminal law use or restraint in criminal power when the conflict involves domestic violence, particularly violence against women. It seems that in those conflicts, judges use the argument that criminal law is not a very useful means to deal with the conflict, that it's a private conflict, that it should be dealt with in a civil law environment or in beyond the criminal justice system. So the women's rights movement has fought against these conceptions of criminal law, which excluded women, in order to have those cases prosecuted. And there was a very famous ruling last year of our Supreme Court, which said that probation and other alternative means of the criminal prosecution were against the obligations Argentina has regarding the fight and the eradication of crimes against women, violence against women. So that ruling has, which was delivered last year, has been an obstacle to probation in these cases. So many cases are going to trial. And that was considered as a victory for the feminist movement, because nowadays we have more prosecutions of these crimes which were usually excluded. But it has also been under a lot of criticism, this ruling, and nowadays it is, because For other people who want to see criminal law as a subsidiary means, as like the last resource for the state to deal with conflict, for these people it means, making bigger criminal law, criminalizing a lot of people, and well, all the negative effects we find in criminal law. So we are under a lot of discussion right now, and you see these discussions in courts where some defendants ask for a probation and the probation is denied and the guy is sent to trial because of this ruling of the Supreme Court. So I see here a tension because we see that usually all these arguments of making criminal law the last resource or this parsimony or moderation in the exercise of criminal law is used for this kind of crimes. But at the same time, when this ruling appeared, the Supreme Court was under a lot of criticism because they said you are fostering the use of criminal law, which should be the last resource. So I see here a tension between victims' rights and defendants' rights, which is very difficult to manage.
Thank you. One question. So probation is an alternative to trial, is it?
Yes, and it does not mean an acknowledgement of responsibility. It's impunity, because the defendant is sent to make some community services, but he is not condemned, and he does not acknowledge the responsibility.
Right.
It's just putting between brackets the proceedings, and if he complies with these community services and conduct rules, it will be as if this prosecution had never existed. So it's not a record.
Right, thank you. I think the first step is to get clear about about the notion of public wrongs. As I say, judges will portray this as a private matter to be sorted out between the parties concerned. If you've got a conflict, a trouble, then you sort it out privately, and that's not the state's business. As criminal law is properly concerned with wrongs which are our collective business. In that sense, they're public wrongs, they're wrongs which concern us as members of the public, as citizens. And one important move has been, certainly in Britain and clearly here as well, is to recognise that domestic violence is that kind of wrong. Someone is being indubitably wronged. And to recognise the victim as our fellow is to recognise that they've been wronged, and this matters to us too. So the first step is to recognise that domestic violence, like other kinds of violence, is a public, not a private wrong. It's done in private, but it concerns all of us publicly. So it's a public wrong, therefore it's in principle worthy of the criminal law. It's a public wrong which the criminal law should mark as such. So then we should define domestic violence as a criminal, not a civil matter. Then the question is, okay, what now do in fact should we do about cases of domestic violence, and should they go to trial? And I think that, so I think it's right, this is one weakness of the slogan of criminal law as a last resort. We have good reason to try the person who beats up his wife. He's committed a wrong which should be marked as such, a wrong for which he should answer. So we have very good reason to put him on trial. That's separate from the question of what then should happen if he's convicted. And I think that certainly in Britain, probation is a sentence after conviction. You're convicted, your crime is marked, you're censured for your wrongdoing. And then we ask, what now do we do? Do we imprison you, or do we put you on probation, or require you to take a program? And that is what comes after the conviction. So it seems to me that it's important to have the trial, but then ask seriously what kinds of punishment are appropriate in terms both of their meaning and of their effect. Of course, there are still complications in cases where the victim doesn't want to prosecute for a variety of possible reasons. They say, no, don't take the case forward. I think, again, that to recognise this as a serious public wrong is to say we have reason to prosecute, even if the victim doesn't want to, because it's our business to mark this as a wrong. Not always conclusive reason. There's a balancing here. What will the effect on the victim be, and so on? But still, the reason doesn't depend upon the victim's wishes. And that's part of seeing the crime as a public wrong. So I think it's important to separate the question of should we have it as a criminal offence which goes to trial from the question of what kind of sentence is appropriate after conviction.
Yes, here there are alternatives. That's the main problem. Here, or you go to trial, or you have the probation. And the trial, it can only end if it ends in a conviction, except imprisonment. It can be not effective, maybe. It can be left, in suspense. But it's a conviction to prison. There are no alternatives.
Another question here. Then,
Hello. If I didn't understand wrong, you suggested that imprisonment could be symbolically and materially inclusionary, and one way to show this was allowing inmates to vote. That would be just an expression of that inclusionary imprisonment. Now, in Argentina, there's a very popular criminal theory among judges and professionals, which I may translate as criminal skepticism. And basically what this theory suggests is that rehabilitation is not possible, not only because, it's not possible on the grounds of experience. First, because experience every day shows that the ones convicted, when they go out of jail, they are not rehabilitated. And then the second argument to support this claim is that prisons are in structure not meant to rehabilitate people. Because of the way prisons are designed, this is basically an impossible idea. This has led to judges and to lawyers to have no hopes regarding convictions and rehabilitation. So, as cynical as it may sound, many judges apply convictions every day, not having any kind of hope of rehabilitation, and they do it because they have no other chance under the circumstances. Now, I wanted to ask you, what would you say, what would you have to say against this kind of theory?
Several things. I agree that rehabilitation, again, if you look certainly at many prisons in Britain and in America, rehabilitation is a fantasy. It's a joke to think it could be going on. That shows something about our prisons and how utterly inadequate they are as prisons. So one answer is to think more carefully, well, A, who do we imprison? And B, what kinds of prison do we have? What kinds of prison should we aim to construct, which might make rehabilitation possible? I think there are models elsewhere. If you look at some models in other parts of Europe, for instance, prisons are quite different. And there it makes sense to think what's going on is a process both at the time of recognizing the person as a citizen serving a prison sentence. Because they're addressed with respect, they still get to vote and so on. So even while in prison, they're treated as citizens. And the thought that they could then also, there is some prospect of rehabilitation. That's one point. The second, I'm sure it might well be true that whatever our prisons are like, many of those, perhaps most of those who go to prison will also reoffend later on. It could well be true that nothing we can do would prevent even the majority from reoffending. But rehabilitation has two meanings to it. One is, if you like, the rich substantive notion of being genuinely reformed. Well, no, actually, I'm moving too fast again. Does rehabilitation involve the idea that you won't reoffend? Again, reform involves that. Reform is you're reformed and therefore you don't reoffend or don't reoffend so seriously. Rehabilitation has partly a formal character. You are formally readmitted, as it were, to what you were excluded from. Excuse me. You're welcome back. That's formal. Substantively, you can then live again an ordinary life. And rehabilitation is consistent with at least some kinds of reoffending. So I'm not sure reoffending negates rehabilitation. That was the second point. There was in my mind a third point, which is now I've now forgotten. But I think it matters how much we think punishment should aim to achieve. In part, punishment is a matter of taking seriously the wrong, saying, here's what you have done, recognize what you've done, and here's the ritual you must undertake to show that recognition. We hope that as a result, you will be less likely to offend again in quite the same way. But in terms of preventing reoffending, punishment will play at most a rather small part in that. A larger part will be played by various kinds of welfare and educational enterprise. So punishment shouldn't be seen as a surefire way of preventing reoffending. It shouldn't be judged a failure if it doesn't. But I still think the important point, though, is that while people are in prison, we should do all we can still to address them and treat them as citizens. We should include, I think that the right to vote is, I think, symbolically important for just that reason. But also how they're addressed by the prison officers. These things matter not because they'll make future good behaviour more likely, but just because they're ways of still recognising the person as a fellow.
Thank you. It was a great talk. I have two questions. The first one relates to the conception of democracy that underlies your theory. You have insisted in, I think, in this conception of democracy. In a democracy, if we as citizens can be deemed authors of the law. So the central notion is authorship, and relating to the notion of collective self-government. But I was wondering what normative work is the notion of authorship doing in your criminal law theory, and especially if it's relevant for the justification of punishment, because I don't find that conception of democracy attractive, so I want to know where you think it's relevant for your theory of punishment. The second question relates this exclusionary dichotomy. I think the price we are paying for inclusion in your theory is too high. I mean, we can see the offender as a fellow citizen only if we consider him as in debt to us. He owes us something. He must pay for what he did. But, of course, if the only alternative to that is he loses his citizenship, then your alternative seems more inclusive, but there are other options. For example, we could see him as someone that neither has lost his citizenship nor he owes us anything, but just that given that he offended or given that he committed a crime, we are entitled to do something about it, maybe to punish him. But he doesn't owe us anything, nor he has lost his citizenship.
Okay, thank you. As to authorship, it's worth distinguishing two kinds of crime, because the law figures differently in the two cases. First, there are the so-called mala in se, crimes which involve wrongs which are wrong independently of law. The familiar central crimes of attacking a person and so on. In those cases, the law doesn't make the action wrong. The law defines those as wrongs which are seen as public wrongs, wrongs which you'll answer publicly. So the authorship, it's not that we make murder wrong. Rather, we make murder our business collectively. That's the authorship in that context. And I think that I'm not suggesting that somehow every citizen is involved anew in making the law every year. Authorship is a matter of being, if you like, accepting as mine the laws into which I'm born, but which also I have some role in being able to change or arguing for change. So authorship is going to be a fairly complicated and nuanced notion here. But there must be some sense that not just that I accept the law as having authority, but it's a law which I can take part in developing, adapting, changing, and so on. That potential is important, I think, in authorship. As to the second question, in one way, you're certainly right that as between exclusion and kind of active punishment, there are alternatives, including punishment being imposed on the passive offender. I still think that if you ask what is it to be a citizen in a republic, the answer must emphasize citizens as playing a part in the polity's governance. That's why I said citizenship is essentially an active notion. This is our law. If it's our law, then we, as citizens, are engaged in its development, its application, its administration. If you take that view of citizenship as being essentially active, so it's really our law, it's really a law which we ourselves have a responsibility to develop, sustain and apply, then that too will apply to offenders. They too are citizens and they have duties in relation to their own offending. So I do want to, again, this is not some kind of knockdown argument. I think here's a conception of citizenship as essentially involving activity, a conception of criminal law as aspiring to make us partners in the law's enterprise. And that will then include offenders as partners. And that will then mean they have an active role to play in punishing themselves. So I don't want to make that as not a, again, not that as a conception which seems to me should appeal to us if we take seriously citizenship as active engagement in the polity's life.
Okay, we don't have so much more time, so there are two questions at least, maybe one more, but so now Marcelo, then Gustavo, and yeah, okay, and finally.
I am always surprised by the absence of a particular argument in the criticisms of the current models of incarceration and the abuse of these exclusionary measures. And it's the argument based on the impact of these measures of incarceration in general on the family of the offenders. I think this is a particularly effective argument because it points to the suffering of people who are innocent. So I want you to, what do you think about this?
I want arguments that will also apply to those who are friendless and familyless. So the offender who has no family, no friends, there too, there is good reasons not to imprison, not to exclude. So I agree, the suffering of families is important. And that's a further objection to imprisoning those who have dependents and families who will suffer. But there are many who don't have such dependents, and they too matter. Well, what can we do to them? If we focus on the families, then we think, well, that's fine. They have no families, then we can imprison them. That's not right. So our arguments, which are more general than the one you're offering, which apply to all offenders.
No.
Antony, focusing in the innocence to be restored, I always tend to think that in the process of dialogue that you propose as a trial, we should expect something from the offender. I mean, I'm particularly interested in repentance, but we can expect, as you say, a justification, an excuse, or an explanation of the facts of the crime, perhaps. Something that makes simple to us to understand why he did or she did that. But if that doesn't happen, should we treat them as another offender that tried to explain what happened or say something? I mean, in cases in which someone said that I was right in what I did, so this is an unfair trial, that isn't just. I'm right, you are wrong, and I will do the same if you have the opportunity to do the same. So should we treat them differently, take into account this particular situation and their participation in this dialogue of the trial?
I think there are two different questions there. One is whether how the defendant behaves at the trial should affect their sentence. Whether if you take part in the trial, whether you confess, you should get a lighter sentence. That's one issue. The other is, should it make a difference to how we behave after they've been punished? I wasn't sure which you were thinking of there, or were you thinking of both questions?
I was thinking how to treat them as innocent or to be part, just to be part again of the community if during the trial he acts in that way. So it should be the same for us, or it should change something that his actions during the trial will be passive or ignoring the trial.
I think I want to say that what matters is the formal ritual of trial and punishment. The person has been tried, they've been censured, they've undergone the punishment, whether willingly or not, they've undertaken it. And that then gives them formal rehabilitation. Punishment is, in that sense, punishment is finite. We don't try to work out, are you really repentant? Are you really reformed? For one reason, it's very hard to determine that. For another, that's very intrusive, if you like. We've got intrusive measures. We treat you as having paid. I think the notion of paying your debt is a serious one, that here's what you must undertake or undergo to mark a recognition of what you have done. Once you've done that, then we start again. And then you reoffend, and then you go through it again. So I think that's the crucial move, to say that we don't try to ensure that in fact you're repentant before we let you back.
That's what if I feel part of the community, I want to be part of the community again after the punishment. So I would like to say the truth or explain what happened, because I belong to this community. I want to be part of it. I don't want to be excluded. So.
Hi. How do you think your theory in terms of crimes, massive crimes in international courts, when, for example, an offender is in the community he belongs originally, is not a crime, the act he made, but it's a crime in international terms. He's not a citizen of the country who is pursuing the trial, and maybe he doesn't think he commit a felony, because it's not a felony in his community originally.
Sorry, I didn't catch the start of that.
Si puede decir el comienzo otra vez.
Okay. How do you think, or how do you see, in terms of your theory, in the treatment of the international criminal, massive criminal, how do you think the offender must be treated by an international court?
Yes, that's difficult. I'm very uncertain about the international criminal process. Here are two different stories one could tell about the authority of the international courts. One is to say that they are essentially a fallback. That if you're dealing with crimes committed within a political community, crimes against humanity committed within a state, one theory is that ideally they should be tried within that state itself. The person horrendous in their character implications, that for those crimes you answer not just to this or that local polity, but to humanity. And the court then speaks for humanity. And that's a rhetoric of some of the international courts' documentation. And I used to think that was plausible. But then humanity is not a notion of a community to which you could answer. I'm more inclined now to think that there is no such thing as a community, there is no political community of humanity, and thus no court can speak for humanity as a political community. The most you have, at least in aspiration, is a community of nations. And you might then see the international court as acting on behalf of citizens whose own state has let them down. So we as citizens have the right to call to account the person who committed these crimes, but our own courts don't or won't or can't do it. And that's where the international court might come in. So the default should be the person is tried in their own national courts. And then the ICC is a second best. I think that's my current view, but I'm not confident of it. Again, it's still the question. The question is still, well, to whom do you answer for what kinds of wrong? And domestic criminal law says you answer to your fellow citizens for the crimes you commit within that polity. The question is, are the crimes committed within the polity, like crimes against humanity, which are such that you answer not just to your fellow citizens, but to some larger community? If so, what is that larger community? And I'm not sure there is one in political terms. Morally, yes, but not politically.
Okay, I think we're done. So thanks so much, Antony, for being here and being so kind answering all these numerous questions. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, too.
Thank you. No, there were many very good who were silent.